good evening, and on behalf of the Ladies Study Group in Kolkata, I would like to wish each and every one of you who has joined us today a very, very warm welcome. While any one day or any one month is never enough to celebrate us all as empowered women, the month of March every year does provide us with the perfect opportunity to remind ourselves and those around us of just how important it is to honor ourselves as women. The 2021 theme for women has appropriately been hashtagged as Choose to Challenge because it is only a challenged world that can and will create an alert world for each and every one of us. More importantly, it is only from challenge that we can bring about a change, and so it is vital to make the correct choice and choose to challenge. And perhaps there is no woman who fits this tag better in India than our speaker, Barkha Dutt. Bold, outspoken, fearless, an award winning journalist, a Padmashree recipient, a thought leader, and now an entrepreneur. Please welcome to our screens Barkha Dutt.
Hi, Dia.
Hi, Barkha, and thank you for so much for doing this. I know you've just finished a session, you're heading into another, so we are truly grateful for this.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
So when I think of you, Barkha, there are just so many images that flash in my mind. You remind me of CNN's Christiane Amanpour and her fearless coverage of the international war zones, of Oprah Winfrey and her incredible ability to connect with the human side of every story, and of course, of Michelle Obama, who constantly inspires all of us as women to push our own limits. You, Barkha, are truly limitless, and I'm so honored to have this
Thank you.
opportunity to do this session with you for Ladies Study Group. And
Thank you
today,
so much.
and there's another special thing that we are doing together, Varka, and I want to announce that we at Ladies Study Group in Kolkata are privileged to be going live with you, Barkha, on your Mojo channel today on YouTube simultaneously, which is
That's
so
it.
exciting for all of us. To have you, Barkha, on the other side is going to be very interesting. So let's start straight away.
Sure.
So there are so many different questions I have for you. And I'm going to start right at the beginning. I think the very first role in our lives that each one of us plays is that of being a daughter. So while today we all know you as this fearless and courageous and fiery journalist, a lot of people say that you are the first female war correspondent in India. But if I'm correct, it was actually your mother, the famed journalist Prabha Dutt, who was the real trailblazer, the first war correspondent, your biggest inspiration, and your role model. So let's begin today with this empowering story.
Thank you, Dia. And first, thank you for the analogies with three of my favorite women, Christiane, Michelle Obama, and Oprah. I've actually had the opportunity to interview Oprah Winfrey once at the Jaipur Literature
Wow.
Festival. And when I had to introduce her, I did this long introduction, and she looked at me and she said, "Where are your papers? Where are your notes? Where is your teleprompter?" And I told her I don't use one, and she said, "I don't believe that. And show me. You must be hiding a prompter or a piece of paper somewhere." And I said, "I've never used one in my life." So she was quite impressed, and that was a compliment that actually meant something coming from
Amazing.
her. So thanks for
Amazing.
the generous introduction, and thanks for bringing up my mom. I think the reason that a lot of people don't know the story of Prabha Dutt is because she was a journalist in an age when there was no television. She was a newspaper journalist. She started her career with the Hindustan Times, and when she died at the age of 40, she was working at India Today. She became a journalist when she was 19 years old, and when she walked into the Hindustan Times to apply for a job and to be interviewed, the editor had no embarrassment in telling her that the only use for women journalists was to cover the flower shows in the city.
Oh
So it
my
was a fight from the first day. And she was up for the challenge, and she was like, "You know what, I'm going to prove to you that like what I'm capable of." And she went on to head the bureau. And you're absolutely right, in 1965, when the war breaks out between India and Pakistan, she says to the editor that, "I'd like to go and cover this story." And the editor says, of course, by now having accepted that she can do more than cover flash shows, "Hey, we can't send women to the front line. Are you crazy? We can't send a woman to report a war." And she said, you know what, if you're not going to let me report the biggest story that there is, then I may as well go and take a few days off. I may as well go on chutti. So she went with her notepad and pen by herself, alone, to the Punjab border, which was where the war was unfolding. She had a cousin in the military. And she started sending dispatches, and of course, the newspaper published them. So, yes, she was the first woman war correspondent. And, in 1999, all those decades later, when I had
Later.
to persuade the military to let me go to Kargil, and they said the same thing to me. They said, "How can we send a woman to the war front? And there are no bathrooms, there's no place to sleep. What will you do for food?" And it was just deja vu, because as a teenager, as a child, I had been so fundamentally shaped and formed by this argument that my mother had had, that I knew what argument to had, and I got my way. But she was an abiding influence on my life, and I wrote an essay once saying, "Whatever I do, my mother's done first." And literally, that is true, from investigative journalism to being a war correspondent to a photograph that hangs in my home that has her squished between Paul McCartney and John Lennon when the Beatles came to
Okay.
India. And I'm like, okay, everything else I've managed, but that story I never got to do.
And you also recently announced a prize in her name, right?
Yes.
I just read about that on Twitter.
Yes, it
Yes.
was her death anniversary on the 1st of March, and I have announced a 1 lakh rupee annual award for men or women pursuing a journalistic project, and this will be given out
Fantastic.
annually starting this year.
Fantastic. So you wanted to be, I believe, first a filmmaker and a lawyer, and then you landed up in journalism and NDTV. How did that happen?
I had some resistance to the idea of doing what my mother did, right? Like I thought that was a bit boring. Kids should not do what their parents did. So I'd been brought up on this staple diet of news, and my parents famously would tell me that when I was 5 years old, I would be made to identify the names of global leaders from the covers of Time magazine. So news was a very early exposure in my life. But I thought in my rebellious way, why should I be what my mother is? And so I thought I'd make movies or I'd be a lawyer. I studied literature at Stevens, and then I did my first master's at Jamia Millia, which is the Mass Communication Research Center. It was the only one of its kind there. Shah Rukh Khan was the year before me. So that was also its claim to fame, though he wasn't a couple of years before me, not the year before me, a couple of years before me. And then I did my second master's from Columbia in New York. And I trained to be a sound mixer. I was
Okay.
I trained to edit films when films
Okay.
were still edited not on what is called non-linear editing, which is modern software, but when you actually cut and spliced films. I learned how to edit films. I trained to be a sound engineer. So when I applied to NDTV for a job, there was no private news in India. So this is 1995. No private news in India. No private channels. And only two organizations, India Today and NDTV, are producing 30-minute capsules, one in Hindi, one in English, half an hour every day for Doordarshan, which is the public broadcaster. And I go and I make sound in the studio. And
Awesome.
then they said, "Oh, hey, why don't you just try reporting?" And I tried it. I loved it, and then I couldn't
You
leave
love
it
it.
and
I
live
couldn't leave
without
it.
it. And it was like a love affair that carries on.
And then I think, like you mentioned, 1999, India's first televised war. And I think
Mhm.
you've referred to it as your most transformative experience so far, right?
Yeah.
So, how did you manage, firstly, to convince NDTV to let you go and let the army, let a young 26-year-old cover everything? What was that like?
Oh, it was almost more
Crazy.
difficult. It was almost more difficult to get them to say yes than it was to cover the war. But of course, I say that facetiously. I- Look, I had never covered. I had had no exposure to the military. I didn't come from a military family. I had never seen a war in my adult lifetime. We had no idea what we were in for. And although it was the first televised war of its kind in India, it was a televised war without live broadcasting. So let me
True.
explain simply for your audience what that means. There were no mobile phones. Mobile phones were blocked in Jammu and Kashmir, Kargil's in Jammu and Kashmir. So where the war was, there were no phones. There were no broadcast vans. So what we had to do was to actually film whatever was happening, and then we would walk every day kilometers on those mountain roads, and we would go to the nearest makeshift airfield where army helicopters were carrying the coffins of our soldiers back home. And we would beg the pilots, "Can you take our tapes?" At that time, everybody's still short on tape. "Can you take our tapes back? Can you carry our tapes back?" And, I I remember the first time I was standing next to a Bofors gun, and the recoil from it, I jumped. And there was no time for take two. So my piece to camera, what I was saying to camera, went with me jumping like that, right? And I remember Vikram Batra. We today know him as a household name. We know of this swashbuckling, handsome young officer who famously said, "Ye dil mange more." That was my interview, and that was in response to my asking him, "Aren't you scared?" And he threw his head back and he laughed and he had a twinkle in his eye and he said, "Scared? Ye dil mange more," which used to be the Pepsi
Pepsi
Cola
slogan.
slogan in those
Correct.
days.
Yeah.
It just became
Yeah.
like this cult sort of slogan. And for me, he was one of the first interviews I did, and he was the first obituary I would write. And a lot of people sort of said, "Weren't you scared?" Right? And I'd be lying if I said there was no fear, because how can there not be fear when you're every day walking through sort of a
Of course.
storm of bombs
Absolutely.
falling on you, you're lying flat, taking cover, sometimes behind a truck's tire, sometimes in an underground bunker where you're just the only woman in a cupboard-sized space under the ground with 20 other men whom you've never met in your life and will never meet again. Of course, there's fear, but what happens is that there's something much larger that displaces the fear. Two things displace the fear: survival, got to think of how to make it out of there alive, and two, how to tell the story. And the
Amazing.
combination of these two things, for me, Dia, in some ways, I see this year, 2020, as the bookend of
Very
Kargil, because I spent the year covering COVID, and it was exactly the same two impulses: survival. How do you survive this virus while telling the story? And how do you tell the story? And so for me, these two stories, Kargil in 1999, COVID in 2020, are the bookends of my life with exactly the same impulses. The impulse to go into the most difficult place to tell the story,
places.
the
Correct.
displacement
Correct.
of fear, the adrenaline, the challenge of bringing that story back and surviving to live another day.
And also in Kargil, I believe your driver ran away
Oh,
and
yeah.
your cameraman ran away. So, what happened to all of them?
Like, the driver did run away. The driver did run
Left you
away.
with, took the clothes too, I believe. Your clothes also disappeared.
I like the fact that you're so well researched, and I think I need to recruit you immediately into being part of my team and
Done,
doing
done.
more great level of detailed research. Yes, the car, we had hired a car from Leh. We had driven from Ladakh to Kargil. And when the bombs started coming from the Pakistani side, so there might be people in your audience who are too young to know what happened in Kargil. So let me just in one sentence say what happened in Kargil.
That's
On
true,
Indian
actually.
territory, on mountain tops, Pakistanis came in, both terrorists and regular soldiers of the Pakistan army, and occupied land that belonged to India. And this happened at the height of winter, when the custom was that those posts would be vacated. The posts would be vacated because it was too cold and it was an inhospitable terrain and so on. And when the Indian forces withdrew from those posts, the Pakistanis came and captured them. Now the challenge was to get the Pakistanis out. But this was a mountain war where, militarily speaking, the Pakistanis had the advantage because the Pakistanis were on a height. They were on our mountain peaks, and we were at the bottom of the highway, using sort of rocket launchers and so on to throw bombs at the mountain peaks. And at the same time, three flanks of mountains, our soldiers were climbing up to physically displace them and get them out of our land. This was the Kargil war. Up jagged peaks in sub-zero temperatures, where our soldiers went without snow boots and night vision devices, climbing in the dead of night to displace these intruders from our territory. That was what is known as the Kargil War, right? Now, what happened was, therefore, a large part of this war was unfolding on the national highway, where these Bofors guns and the rocket launchers were placed, and the military the artillery units were targeting these peaks to throw
Peaks of
bombs
it.
at the Pakistanis. The car that we had hired was hired from Ladakh to travel to Kargil, and it got bombed. It got shelled, as they say, by the Pakistani bombs, because when we were bombing, the Pakistanis were bombing back, right? So the driver ran away. With the cameraman, my cameraman Ajmal Jami, he got separated from me. The first time these bombs came raining down from the Pakistani side, we all ran. We just ran. We were on the road. We ran to take shelter. And I happened to be standing somewhere we had a satellite phone. I was trying to work a satellite phone because there were no mobile phones to try and tell the newsroom in Delhi that this is what's happening. And a soldier leapt out, his hand at me, and he said, "Ma'am, you're going to get killed. You're standing next to an ammunition dump. If a bomb falls on this, you're going to blow up, and this whole space will blow up. You need to get out of here." And I was like, "But I've lost my cameraman," because in that sort of as the bombs came down, there were clouds of smoke and everybody was running in all directions and just trying to take shelter where they could. I got separated from him. And I wasn't willing to walk away from Jami, leaving him out there seeking shelter. So he said to me, this soldier, and I will sort of remember him for the rest of my life because he saved my life and he saved my cameraman's life. And he said, "You go into this bunker, I'll find him." So he pushed me into this sort of underground bunker where there were about 15 other soldiers. He found my cameraman, he brought him back to safety, and we spent the night in that underground bunker. So that's what happened.
Amazing. I think, through the way you described it so beautifully, we've all relived that whole incident again with you. So thank you for refreshing all of us on that. I think we tend to forget otherwise, about what all the different struggles that have happened in the past. So I'm sure it must have taken you a long time also to recover from those kind of nights that you experienced at Kargil. How did you deal with that?
So for me, because I had to fight so hard to report the story, I was very conscious of not being a girl at the war front. And in my 20s, I had some idea of what that meant. Today, I have no shyness about crying. I cry quite easily. I cry in front of people. I cry on camera. I cry when I'm angry. I cry when I'm sad. I also cry when I'm happy. But when I was in my mid 20s and I had to go and report this war and I really had to prove myself and I really had to fight for this assignment, I was very conscious of not being considered a girly girl. So that it was very important for me to display no emotion. So, these soldiers who had saved our life and taken us into this bunker, it so happened that that was the night of what came to be called as the Tiger Hill assault. Tiger Hill was one of the most prominent features that the Pakistanis had occupied. And because it was close to the national highway, that operation could be kind of caught on camera. And so the whole country had seen it. When Tiger Hill was reclaimed by India, the men who had saved our lives, they got their marching orders to go up. In other words, it was their turn to march up the mountains. Next was their turn. And we knew that these men who had saved our lives may not come back alive again. So there was that great sense of, oh my God, these people saved our lives and we may never see them again. And we were four of us traveling together, me, my cameraman, Gaurav Sawant, who now works at India Today, and V. Shashi Kumar, who was a print journalist. So we were the four mavericks, who would just go up and down this highway telling the story of this war. And I remember when the marching orders came, the three men cried. The three men in my group, my colleagues, cried because they felt that these soldiers who had saved our lives might be walking into near death or almost certain death. And I was so conscious of being female and not wanting to be called a typical girl that I just held back all emotion. And what happened to me was, like, only when I got back to Delhi and many weeks later, I would find that I couldn't sleep at night and I would wake up every night with this dream that these men had died. So I would wake
Okay.
up in the middle of the night, I could not sleep. And then I would cry. But that happened only after the war was over. And I would not allow myself that emotion while I was reporting the war. And it was very difficult to get over it because I think when you're so young and you see that level of both courage and vulnerability, you see military conflict. I mean, I consider it an honor and a privilege to have had the chance to report that war. I think it's the kind of story journalists should literally die for.
Absolutely.
And for me, I call it a masterclass in life. I learned so much about what is courage, what is actually courage. These soldiers were my age. They were younger than me. Most of them were 23, 24 years old. And I remember one of them telling me, and I would always be very interested in, like, more than the hardware, ki ye Bofors hai, ye MBRL hai, which is a multi-barrel rocket launcher. I was very interested in the psychology of these minds. What does a mind think before a soldier's mind,
Absolutely. Yeah.
is walking into possible death? What is that mind thinking? And I remember this young captain telling me, I see my life in fast forward like a movie playing in my head. And if I don't do this now, I have failed my life. So you saw the fear even in them because they were young boys. There were boys who would be men, but you saw again how they crossed that fear, how they surmounted it, how they got past it. And in so many ways, it was a masterclass in journalism, it was a masterclass in life, it was a masterclass in emotions. Like, I think I just grew up,
Everything. Yeah.
like, that was my moment of adulthood. I think I was pretty much of an immature kid till I went and reported that war.
And then, of course, there was that painful controversy about the satellite iridium phone that, that did follow. Then you had that lovely meeting, I believe, with General Malik.
Yeah.
And so, can you tell
So
us
it was
about that?
sure because you know what? It was a early lesson in life, and I'm glad I learned it in my 20s because it continues to happen. I'm 49 now. It continues to happen that if you're successful and you're a woman, there will be every attempt to create falsehoods about you and drag you down somehow, right? Every
So
attempt.
true.
So I come back from
So
this
true.
war and I find there's some bizarre rumor that I have used. Oh, there were variations of that rumor. So the rumor you've heard is that there was a satellite phone and maybe that gave away
Yes.
a location of the Indian troops.
Correct. Correct.
The version
Yes.
I'd heard was that my camera light had given away that position. Someone else
Oh,
said I
God.
lit a matchstick. I'd heard many variations of it, but I didn't hear any of this till I came back until the war was over, because there was no communication. We were too busy trying to survive and do our job when we were in Kargil. And I remember, like, everybody called me to congratulate me on, like, when I say everybody, I mean, like, I remember the first call when Amitabh Bachchan called me and every corporate leader called me. I didn't know anybody. I was a young kid. I was like 2 years into journalism, right? And then I got a call from the army chief and General VP Malik said, I'd like you to come over for a cup of tea. So I went over for a cup of tea and he said, I just want to thank you because, your story, your reporting single-handedly was a force multiplier for the troops. And thank you for what you've done. And then he saw I was looking a bit troubled and he said, you look a bit troubled. Is there something on your mind? And I said, General, I've heard these rumors. And, there were many other journalists there. So I don't know why the story is only about me. But is there any truth to the fact, did I inadvertently do anything to give away the troops of our men? And he was like, this is absolute rubbish, Barkha. Don't even think about it. This is people just out to get you. I forgot about it, and since then, it's just hilarious that General Malik actually put this story in his autobiography on Kargil. He's put it on record, and you'll still have like these trolls, these two-bit trolls, come and say, "Oh, but you gave us the location of our men," and I'm like, earlier I used to respond. Now I'm like, okay, whatever. I have the army chief in his memoirs. I don't need anything else.
Absolutely, absolutely. You don't need anything else, absolutely. And before we move on, there's something on a lighter note I wanted you to share about what Preeti Zinta said to you about the movie that they made on your
Oh
role.
God, you really have done your research.
I
Yeah,
done
so
my research and we must share that story. It's very funny.
it is a funny story. So you make it out of this war. I lived in the same pair of jeans and shirts for 15 days. Because the driver had run away, he also took my knapsack. I didn't have underclothes. I was on my period during the war. I used to take a bottle
Oh
of
my
water. There were
God.
no sanitary pads. Go behind some tree, wash myself, come back. That's what trained me to be this journalist, right? And then X number of years later, Javed Akhtar, who's a dear friend, says, I'm going to write a script about your coverage of the war. He writes Laksh. He casts Preeti Zinta. Preeti Zinta calls me to prep for her role. So we're having this conversation. And then I'm telling her all this. And she's like, what makeup did you use? And I was just horrified. I was horrified beyond description. I didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. And, I just said, I don't think you get it. I didn't have a fresh pair
Question
of
of me.
I didn't have underwear. You're asking me what makeup I use, right? So yeah, funny story, but that's
Yeah,
Bollywood.
we had to lighten the mood a bit.
Sure,
So now
of
I
course.
wanted to and now I wanted to come to the migrant exodus that you've covered.
Yeah.
Fantastic reporting, I think. And you brought those stories to all our drawing rooms. All of us were sitting at home, and all of us actually felt like we were front line, getting a ringside seat because of your
Mhm.
Mojo channel, including
Thank
me.
you.
And I think
Thank
it
you.
showed us it was a reality check to all of us, and what we thought the crisis meant and what it actually meant to the migrant worker. So I
Yeah.
want to ask you, what made you do that? I mean, just
Mhm.
take off, drive out of Delhi and start doing that.
Yeah. So that's why I call the COVID year the bookend to my Kargil
Yes,
year, because it was very
yes.
similar in some ways in terms of exposure to danger, not knowing how to survive, not knowing how to tell the story, not knowing what would happen next, and the two most transformative reporting experiences of my life. I would say it was Kargil, and now it's been COVID. And how it started off quite accidentally. The Prime Minister announces the lockdown, and I say, let's just go to Delhi's borders and see what's happening the next day. And I just drive to the border and I find that there are men, women, children walking. They're just walking. And I start talking to them like, why are you walking? And I then discover that everybody, what is a migrant worker? A migrant worker is someone who lives in the village but works in the city. He or she is
Yeah.
mostly a daily wager, don't have permanent homes and survive on daily wages. Now, what had happened was that despite the government order saying that nobody's jobs were to be removed and you had to keep paying daily wages, in small businesses, that was not happening, in small factories and sometimes even in big factories. Combined with the fact that, like everybody else, the migrant worker, India's poor too, felt the need to be with their families. Nobody knew, we forget the panic that people felt about a year ago when nobody knew what COVID was. And you were like, okay, if these are my last moments alive, I need to be with the people I love. But the lockdown was so absolute that there was no bus, train, cycle, nothing. So they were walking. They were just walking, right? And I then realized that I have to follow them. I have to follow them. And so began my journey. Initially, I would drive to a place and then I would drive back to Delhi, mostly living in the car because there was no place to stay. Nothing was available. And then I realized I can't tell this story like this. I have to just go. So we just left a team of four. We covered 24,000 kilometers, 14 states. We went from Delhi to Kerala, came back briefly to go to Ladakh because in the middle of this
Yes.
pandemic, the Chinese incursions had taken place. Came back, went back to Bihar, and that was our journey. So 24,000 kilometers, 14 states, including, it was sad we couldn't make it to Bengal, but I did pretty much everything else, along the way, including Telangana, Kerala, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Ladakh. I mean, a whole lot of states. And it just began with that image of seeing these men, women, and children on foot. And it started to haunt me. Kargil, when I couldn't go there, I would be haunted. I would be haunted by the little information and I couldn't sleep at night. And the same thing happened here. Like I was just haunted by it. I knew that if I'm not out there, I can't live with myself. And for me, it was like a test of journalism. And I think, my regret is that television failed that test because such few people, literally nobody from TV moved out of the studio.
Nobody
There
moved
were
out.
some digital journalists who did, there were some photographers who did, there were some local correspondents who did, but from television, literally nobody did. And so for us, for me at least, it was a very personal test. And the sight of seeing little children walk barefoot under the blazing sun, sometimes through desolate forests, late at night, it just, I kept seeing it over and over again, no matter which state I went to. And, pushed really hard through our work to finally the state stepped in, the Supreme Court stepped in, trains were organized, but it was very late into the pandemic that happened. So I understood very quickly that there are two parts to the story. There is a medical challenge and then there is the humanitarian crisis. And the
Yes.
humanitarian crisis at one point was threatening to be larger than the medical crisis.
But on a personal note, what about your own safety? Weren't you scared of getting COVID? Your family, your friends, didn't they keep calling you saying, "What are you doing, Barkha?"
So my family, I think, has over the years learned to internalize the fact that I won't listen to them. And so therefore they don't try anymore. My father last tried in Kargil to say don't go, and of course I didn't listen. And so it's difficult for them, and I don't want to
I'm
trivialize how
sure.
difficult it is for the
Sure.
family that we live
Absolutely.
in. But
Absolutely.
they have learned to accept who I am. Again, my answer would be the same that it was in Kargil. Like there was in some ways, this was even more uncertain than Kargil because in Kargil, there was a definable visible enemy. And this was very much the invisible enemy. There was so much we didn't know. I also couldn't hold back my emotion, right? So initially, we started off being very careful, wearing our gloves and, you mask and everything. But I remember this one story where I met like this old woman stranded at a railway station in Bombay, the story of Leelavati. And she was this woman sitting alone. She was sobbing. And I had to hug her. So I just went and I hugged her and I held her. And could she have had COVID? Possibly. And then I went into slums. I saw that there were 8 people living in like little narrow like spaces that are frankly smaller than the cupboard where I hang my kurtas. And there were 8 people living in in that space. And, I was in Dharavi reporting from the toilets. There were 8,000 toilets for 8 lakh people. And so I realized that, there is a point after which I can't protect myself. I can only take basic precautions, which is to wash your hands a lot, sanitize, and that's pretty much all you can do. And wear the full PPE when you go into COVID hospitals. By the way, the most frightening thing for me is really strange was wearing that PPE. It was almost like I was scared of nothing else. But every time I would wear that full kit, and we'd have to wear it to enter a COVID hospital, I would be claustrophobic, and I would, after the story, literally rip it off. And every night without fail, the day I wore a PPE, I would be ill. I would have a kind of fever. I would cry. It would have the most bizarre sort of impact on me. And I thought something's wrong with me. And then I met a nurse in a hospital in Bombay, at Kama Hospital, which is the hospital, by the way, on 26/11 that Ajmal Kasab, carrying his AK-47s, had come
Yes,
into,
yes,
and
I
had
remember
blindly,
that.
yeah. So I meet this extraordinary nurse who was on duty on 26/11. So look at her story, right? So she's on duty on 26/11. She hides. She was working with the new mothers, so she hides all the mother and children, and she makes them all turn off their phones. She was recounting the 26/11 experience to me, and then she starts telling me how every time she wears the PPE, she feels sick. And I said, oh my God, that happens to me too. And then she was trying to explain it, that there's a kind of asphyxiation that happens, it's the smell of plastic, it's that your oxygen flow stops. And that is why COVID duty, if the normal shift is 8 hours, could not be more than 6 hours. But of course, the PPE, by the way, had not been designed for women, it had been designed for men. You couldn't even go to the bathroom using it. There was nothing cut. Like if you had to go to the loo while wearing a PPE, you have to take off the whole thing, right? So this is how
Correct.
designs are not even, you don't even think of women. The bulk of frontline help in hospitals is by female nurses. So, it was strange things that would trigger me. But once again, my answer would be the same, that there is a displacement of fear that happens. There's never the absence of fear. There's always the displacement of fear.
Yeah. So there are so many stories, human stories that we followed on your channel while you were there. And of course, the Leelavati story, which you all mentioned already, was something that I think touched all of us because we're also ferociously protective about our mothers. And how could this family abandon a mother? It was very, very disturbing. And I think that visual of you hugging her with a little packet of biscuits in her hand,
Yes,
it stayed
yes,
with me, throughout.
yes,
And in fact, I
yes.
shared that with all my members before the program today because it's just something so, so powerful. And it's really become the face, I think, of the migrant crisis. But there were
Yeah.
so many other beautiful stories you covered. There was the story of the 15-year-old Jyoti. Can you tell us about that? That was also very interesting. It was tweeted about by, I think, Ivanka Trump.
Yeah. So Jyoti was this. So, like I said, we have to remember that these were people trying to get home. Home was
Home.
often
Yes.
800 to 1,000 kilometers away, and mostly people walked. But then there was 15-year-old Jyoti who decided to cycle. So she made her father sit in the back of a cycle, and she cycled all the way. And you're right that
Amazing.
Ivanka Trump picked up that story. But you know what? When I interviewed Jyoti didn't see this as some sporting achievement. Jyoti saw
Absolutely.
this as a poor person's need to survive,
Just,
right?
just getting home.
And what getting home, the pursuit of home and the desire to live, what it does to people's inner strength, how children are able to find that strength. So you think of this girl in class 8th or ninth cycling, and in an interview she told me, she said, I wanted to give up so often. Every night I would cry and I would say, we can't do this. Then I would look at my father at the back of my cycle, and I have to get my father home somehow. And when I interviewed her, she'd reached home, and I was like, what is your dream? And she said, all I want to do is go back to school. So actually, people's dreams are very simple. They may show extraordinary courage, but after that courage is over, their dreams are still very tiny. They're very ordinary despite the extraordinariness that they have displayed. So those are the stories that stay with you, right? And some are very uplifting, some are very sad. Like I remember this little 9-year-old kid, finally when the buses came and the trains came, and he was getting onto the bus, and I very playfully said to him, do you know what corona hai? Aapko malum hai COVID kya hai? Aapko malum hai coronavirus kya hai? And he said, हाँ. And I said, kya hai? And he said, iska matlab mujhe khana nahi, coronavirus matlab mujhe khana nahi milta. Right?
My
So
God.
it was a child's sort of understanding of of what it all meant, and it was a very simplistic way. And then I remember there was this other time which really stayed with me. I was in Telangana, and I was on the back of a truck, and there were all these workers paying paying with money that they had taken either by selling their mobile phones or they'd taken loans, getting a spot on this truck. And I was sitting with them, and it suddenly struck me that when you leave, what is it that you carry with you? So this man was carrying like a white plastic bucket, and I said, "Agar aap bura na mane, if you don't feel bad, can I take a peek inside this bucket to see what you're carrying?" And he lifted the lid, and there were his auzars, his workman's tools, the shovel, the spade, right? What he works with. He was a construction worker. And I just felt like there was such dignity of labor in that moment, such dignity of self in that moment. It was so powerful. And he said to me, I want to work, but who's giving me work? I don't want anyone's charity. And he had sold his mobile phone to buy that little spot on the back of that crowded truck. So I think those are the things that really kind of stay with you.
And then in the middle of it all, you went off to Ladakh, like you mentioned. And I think you
Yeah,
did this fantastic interview with Sonam Wangchuk, which I also watched at that time.
yeah,
And for our members who don't know, Sonam Wangchuk is actually the inspiration for Amir Khan's role in Three Idiots. And
that's
he
right.
did a fantastic campaign, which Barkha will share with us during this Chinese
Yeah,
intrusion. So what was that
yeah.
like?
So what happens is that we're about to reach Bihar, and we suddenly see that these Chinese incursions have happened, and it feels to me like a Kargil deja vu. We don't know how it's going to play out, and I'm like, I have to be there. And my producer at the time said, "How are we going to go from Bihar to Ladakh? Like how?" And I'm like, "Okay, we can't drive to Ladakh because we had driven everywhere. There were no flights open, but by then flights had just started opening. So I was like, okay, we'll go to Delhi and we'll fly to Ladakh." So we turned the car around from the Bihar border. We drove back to Delhi. We reached, I think, Delhi at 4 in the morning. 6 a.m. we were on the flight from Ladakh. And then I was there for the rest of the week tracking this Chinese incursion, which, as we now know, has turned out to be like such a major story, almost,
Correct,
sort
correct.
of a bigger adversary than Pakistan. And Sonam Wangchuk, who, as you said, was the inspiration for Three Idiots,
Three
and
idiots.
actually runs a school, that we saw in the movie. He basically said that, look, you're not going to be able to beat China in a militaristic way. So you have to find an economic way. You have to use your wallet to punish them. So he was calling for a kind of all-out economic boycott of Chinese goods. And it's only when he started talking about it that we discovered that so many things we use, we don't even know anymore that they're China manufactured, right? From things that we buy
Absolutely.
on
Yeah,
Diwali
yeah.
to, to,
Correct,
to our
correct.
phones. We don't even know. We don't even pause to think because they have infiltrated the markets in such a
Completely.
in
Yes.
completely. So that was his story, and he's really quite an inspirational figure. He's really done a lot of work with with education and the Ladakhis. I just want to take a moment to mention them. I had all of these retired. For me, it was like life turning full circle because I had all of in Kargil. Some of the bravest soldiers I'd met were from Ladakh, and they also, of course, are mountain men, right? So they're organically able to climb the mountains in a way that soldiers from other parts of the country need some training to do, and there was no time to do
Yeah.
training in Kargil. So the Ladakh scouts and the soldiers from Ladakh were naturals at it. And in Kargil, many men who are not from the army had volunteered from Ladakh to be porters, which is basically to carry, everything from cylinders to equipment to everything for the soldiers because they were able to climb the mountains. And so you had all of these men that I met in Ladakh who had either retired from the army or who had volunteered in Kargil, and they were like, "We're ready to do this again." So very extraordinary people, seem very gentle, very benign in art, but there's like great courage and ferocity and the kind of ferocious strength when needed. Um, and, and I saw that also, and I think Sonam is a lot like that as well.
I like that. And before we move on, going back to the migrant crisis, I wanted to just check how important do you feel is the role of the local NGOs wherever you went? Because that's something that we need to highlight, a lot, I
I
think.
thought it was fabulous, right? I remember in Surat, there was this story I covered that really, two stories really stayed with me. One, in these housing societies, you had women leading this पांच रोटी campaign. And the पांच रोटी campaign was कि अगर आपके घर में दो रोटी बनती है तो आप पांच रोटी बनाइए और आप वो एक्स्ट्रा तीन जो रोटियां हैं वो आप एक you start a collection drive for rotis. So what these women homemakers would do is that they would make everyone decided to make 5 extra rotis in their home, And then all of these rotis would go to feed the migrant workers. So that was something simple. People were just sort of doing it at their own level. There was no politics, no other design. It was just pure human intervention. So that really
Yeah.
stayed with me. And the other story was, we don't actually know that one of the biggest fears in the early stages of the pandemic was burials and cremations. And families were so scared of actually cremating or burying their own that they would just abandon the bodies. And so, I profiled a man in Surat who
Yes,
devoted
absolutely.
his life to performing the last rites for both Hindus and Muslims because nobody else was ready to touch these bodies. So there was also extraordinary kindness of this country that you forget exists, that I think was on display. And civil society, NGOs, they really stepped up where there were vacuums and there was panic and people didn't know what to do. And one has to hold on to that kindness and remember that it exists.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very, very well said. Very true. So, Barkha, the digital platform is definitely the way forward. But saying that, I find that, even in our conversations within my own friend circle, there are so many who are not aware that now news is also available on the digital platform. Because for typically we think news and television, and maybe of course newspapers. So, can you share with all of us how do we access the digital platforms like yours? What is the way forward for that?
Okay. So, firstly, if you look at the data, it will actually tell you that content consumption is completely moving digital.
Yes,
The
it is. Yeah.
numbers will tell you that it is now only a very old demographic that watches TV. That even the demographic that watches TV doesn't do it at an assigned time anymore. That people are consuming more and more video, and they're doing it more and more on their phones or their laptops. And that was one of the reasons, among many. The other reason was my disillusionment with what television news has become and had become, and I just couldn't bear those shouting matches and the end of reporting on television and the end of the reporter on television, who I think is the most important persona in the chain of content creation. And that's what made me move digital. I don't believe digital content is the future. I believe it's the present. I believe if
Present
I
time.
hadn't moved into the digital space, I would have missed this moment and I would have regretted it a few years later. Uh, it's quite simple, really. There are different platforms on which you can access content. One is YouTube, where our platform exists, which is the Mojo Story channel. If you haven't subscribed to it, please do. But there are also pages for these properties on social media that you're used to. So, for example, we have a We the Women page on Facebook. We have a Mojo Story page on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on Twitter. We're pretty much across platforms, and we have a website coming in April. So, if you do a Google search, you'll find us, and that's us. But some of your people you've been used to seeing, a number of people have migrated out of television, right? So a
Very
number
true.
of my colleagues from the NDTV years, even other contemporaries from other channels, have migrated to the digital space. So whether it's a Vikram Chandra or a Faye D'Souza or a Anubha Bhosle, I mean, I'm just picking up three names
Right, right.
at random. You will find them on digital now. So please remember that there is a space outside television. And, for all of you who hate the TV news that you see, because wherever I go, people are like, TV is so boring, it's so loud, it's so
Loud. Loud
meaningless.
is the biggest thing that we all say now.
Support the content that you like, support the journalists that you like. They're fighting individual creative battles. You need to step up and support them.
Very well said. But with the digital medium, it also opens up this whole world of trolling because now suddenly
Mhm.
everybody can access everybody else, right?
Yeah.
And it's such a toxic environment on social media now with trolling, especially for women, I think. So,
Yep.
what do you? I know you think you say you're troll proof, but what do you feel about trolling, and how can we put some kind of check on it?
So I do think I'm troll proof, and I often joke. I often put like really like cheeky photographs, and I say here, this is for all my trolls, and I like baiting them also. But that's me, and I'm not typical. In fact, I think it's not okay because a lot of young women in particular have been pushed off these platforms, have been scared of these platforms, or end up taking positions that they don't really believe in because they feel like if they take a different position, they'll be abused or they'll be mobbed. And let's remember that what we use very casually, the word trolling, is really an online equivalent of a lynch mob. It's a violent thing.
Absolutely,
It's a mob coming
absolutely.
after you, abusing you, threatening you, defaming you, sometimes threatening to rape you, hang you. I mean, it's bullshit what goes on. And I therefore think that the onus is on these platforms to ensure a cleaner space, to ensure that online spaces are treated in the same way as offline spaces are, which is that there is some obligation to keep these spaces safe and clean for everybody, in particular women. But on the flip side, I will say that we pay too much attention to toxicity, right? So let's say I put out a tweet and it's liked by 15,000 people and retweeted by 1,000. We'll still pay more attention to the 40 negative comments below it, but not to the 15,000 people who liked it. So we also have to learn to disengage from these trolls. When I was younger, I used to argue with them thinking they're real people with real opinions. Then I realized they're either organized, or they're just out to try and bully you, or they're bots, they're automated. I mean, there's a whole combination of factors that drives trolling. And the most powerful thing you can do to a troll is to ignore the troll, because the troll then doesn't know what to do with you. If you can just ignore the troll, and Twitter and all now have functions like mute, block,
Correct.
freely block,
Block.
freely mute.
Yes, I think so.
Once
I think
you
block
can-
is the way forward for all of us.
And if they don't exist on your timeline, as far as you're concerned, they don't exist, right?
Exactly. So, how do you manage to remain unbiased and clinically objective? How do you not let your own feelings come in the way when you're doing a story?
So, we live in a very polarized time when, unfortunately, according to me, the media has started taking sides on issues it should not take
Yes, of
sides on.
course, yeah, correct.
I have a Hindi phrase that I'm patenting called chamcha ya morcha. I think the media is either like complete chamcha baz, which is supplicants to whoever's in power, or complete morcha baz, say, oh, we hate these so and so persons, so our job is to somehow get rid of this government or that government. I don't believe in this. I believe in journalism. I believe in what my Columbia University professor taught me: show, don't tell. I believe that my opinion should matter less than what my story is able to convince you of. If my story is able to change your mind, great. If my tweet is changing your mind, there's something wrong. It means my journalism is not strong enough. So I think I am saved by my love for journalism. I really love a good report, a well-reported story. And I think if a well-reported story can make a social intervention, then the story has done its job. But if it needs me, so for example, I'm sure it's very noble, to help workers and feed them, and many NGOs did that. But as a journalist, that was not my job. As a journalist, my job was to tell their story and have that
True.
story create a basis for policy intervention, right? So my way of freeing myself from bias is to focus on the story. The storytelling process has some rules. The rules are very simple. You report all sides of a story. If you make an allegation, you try and contact the person you made an allegation about. A person you tell a story on has the right to reply, and you attribute any claim you make. They're very, very simple rules. If people just follow these rules of journalism, it doesn't matter what their internal bias is, that bias would not be reflected in the story.
I know we're out of time, Barkha, but I have five very short answer questions
Okay.
I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
Okay, so
All right.
just so that we know you all a little better, the personal side of Barkha. So, what is your biggest fear and why?
My biggest fear is failure. And the failure in a benchmark that's not set by anybody else but by myself. If I fail my own standards, then I'm in a bad mood for at least 24 hours.
What is the one thing that people don't know about you?
That I'm addicted to murder mysteries.
Three words to describe yourself.
Obsessive, compulsive, fun.
Okay, and what is the craziest thing that you've done because somebody has dared you? I know that your mother went into a hippopotamus den in Delhi Zoo as a dare. What was your craziest dare?
Because I don't see the reporting crazy things I've done as dares, because I did them from my own volition, I think the craziest thing I've done is quite benign. I've danced on tables more than once
You also stood on top of
in
a car.
response to a dare.
You also jumped on top of a car, right? When you were trying
Oh,
to.
thank you for reminding me. Okay,
See,
that's
my
really
research
crazy.
is very good.
I didn't do it in response to a dare, so that's why I didn't think of
Okay,
it. But
okay.
I'll tell the story anyway. There's a spy coming back from Pakistan, and the RNW, our spy agency, is so Pakistan's handed back this Indian spy, and he's coming out of the Delhi airport, and we're all standing there very young wanting to interview this man, and the spy agency says there's no way you're getting to interview this man. I was crazy enough to get onto the what is it called, this
The bonnet.
the bonnet,
Bonnet.
the bonnet of the ambassador car in which he was sitting. I sat cross-legged on that car. The car moved with him in the car. I'm like, I'm not getting off till you give me a chance to talk to this person. There were different times I wasn't allowed to talk to him, by the way. So yeah, that's pretty crazy, even by my standards.
And when is your interview with Kamala Harris coming out? When are we seeing her on Mojo?
That is my dream interview. I have a full girl crush on Kamala Harris. I think she's absolutely
Me
superb. I
too.
love
Me
the
too.
fact that I just love the fact that she wears her power without any apology. I think that is just so delicious, and I'm
True.
going to put that interview for sure.
And lastly, how is it to be on the other side today? How was it like?
Well, you're a damn good interviewer. You have researched me very well. So it's been
Yes.
a joy. Usually, people ask questions that are very surface level and they haven't done their homework. But it's been a pleasure because you have more than done your homework. You've reminded me of stories that I had forgotten. And that is what an interviewer should be all about.
And I have so many more questions, but since we're
I'm
out of
sorry, but I'll
time,
do another session with the
we're going
ladies
to do
study
another
group.
session. We're going to have you
Promise.
in Calcutta Live. But I'm
Promise.
going
I'll
to
be
ask
coming
my
soon
vice
for the
president.
elections.
Yes,
I'll be
you
coming soon
said
for the
that.
elections, so I'll come and meet you all in person.
And meanwhile, I'm going to ask my vice president, Sumita Roy, to join us.
Okay.
Hello, Barkha. Hello, Barkha.
Hi,
Thank you
ma'am.
for sharing your insightful life story as a journalist. Thank you for your time. Thanks to our members, online viewers, and the media for support. And over to Dia now. Can you hear
Thank you,
me?
ma'am. Thank
Yes,
you. We
we
could hear
heard.
you.
We heard
Absolutely
you
hear
very
you. And
nicely. Thank you again, Barkha, for
thank
inspiring us
you.
all, showing
Thank
us
you.
the path to follow to be limitless on our own individual journeys. And to all of us who've been watching today, support the journalism that you believe in. Support independent media houses like Mojo Story and We the Women as they work so hard to create their islands of excellence and bring us all top quality content. Make your own choices, but remember, encourage the news as opposed to the noise. Stay safe, stay happy, stay motivated, and stay strong. And I would also like to take this opportunity to wish everybody a very happy Women's Day on the 8th of March from the entire team at the Ladies Study Group in Kolkata. And thank you, Barkha, once again.
Thank
We
you.
have to have you in Kolkata with us soon.
Absolutely. Take care. Bye, guys.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye.
Thank you.